Any guidelines about questions?
Yeah, so feel free to submit some questions on Q&A as we go. And if there's some relevant questions that we want to cover at the end of each slide, we'll do that. And then any questions that are left over at the end, we'll also go over. So feel free to post in the Q&A as you see fit, and we'll make sure to get around to them when we can. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you people for coming. Hope you have good air conditioning. The first thing we're going to talk about is what you should take into consideration when you're thinking about where to form your entity and what entity to form. I'm assuming that most of you realize that you should probably form a corporation or an LLC to do business just for the limited liability protection. So one of the first things I ask a new client when they're talking about forming a new entity is whether they think they will ever want to take in investment from outsiders. And the reason I ask that is that, for one, it's a lot easier to take investors into a C Corp than an LLC, just because LLCs operating agreements are all different and very complicated. And a lot of investors don't want to invest in a pass-through entity. But if you are planning to take in investment from outsiders at any point in the business, I always, if it works to be a corporation, I always recommend that people form the corporation in Delaware rather than Massachusetts, because Massachusetts corporation laws are very strange. Investors don't like them. You can get really high filing fees when your stock numbers get up to hundreds of thousands and millions. There's just generally various advantages to being incorporated in Delaware if you are planning to take in outside investors. You can do it through an LLC. We've done that plenty of times, but it's just a little more difficult to get the documents in final form with an LLC. Another consideration, obviously, is whether you want pass-through taxation treatment. If you think that you're going to realize the value of the company at an exit event, you may not care necessarily whether you have pass-through treatment. If you think the business will generate a lot of current cash that you want to be able to distribute to equity holders, that's where you want to have a pass-through entity to avoid a double tax. So we have clients, for instance, that are breweries that are generating current cash and that want to be able to hand it out to their equity owners. And so those are LLCs, and they did take in outside investment. So those are some more of the factors to think about. Another is whether you think you're going to have employees that you want to provide equity incentives to. It's more difficult in an LLC because you need to give profit interests, which are hard for people to understand. In a C Corp, you can do stock options, which pretty much everyone understands how those work. Another reason to consider an LLC is if, for instance, your business partner is putting in all the money and you're putting in your time, and you need to have flexibility in how the thing is governed. You don't want it to be subject to the statutes that govern corporations. The statutes lay out what the board can do, what the board has to vote on, well, not completely, but generally, what the shareholders have a right to vote on. And with an LLC, you can do it however you want, and you can make distributions not in accordance with ownership interests, which you cannot do in a C Corp or an S Corp. So that's another factor to think about. I already spoke a bit about Delaware advantages. Another thing you may have heard of is Internal Revenue Code Section 1202. This allows stockholders of certain C corporations in certain circumstances to exclude up to $10 million of capital gain on an exit. So I have several clients that were LLCs that converted into C Corps just to be able to take advantage of this Section 1202. It can save a lot of taxes if you meet the requirements. Certain types of businesses are not eligible for it, like restaurants, motels, law firms, various things. And there are various requirements. You have to have held the stock for 5 years, and it has to have been originally issued by the corporation. Am I talking too fast? And are there any questions that we should answer now?
So far, you're all set, and we can keep going.
Okay. So even if you're just going to be a two-person show and you're never going to take in outside investment and you're never going to need any stock options or anything like that, it is a good idea to have a stockholders agreement or at least some kind of restrictions on transfer. If you are in an LLC, you really need to have an operating agreement because that's the only document that actually shows who owns the LLC. It doesn't get on file when you form an LLC in Massachusetts or Delaware or most states. So the only documentation of who owns it is the operating agreement. That's why even if you're a single member LLC, it's a good idea to have a single member operating agreement. But when you have 2 or 3 or 4 co-founders, you should definitely have a stockholders agreement or an operating agreement, partly because you don't want your partner to be able to move away to Montana and maintain 25% of the business, especially if all 4 of you were supposed to provide services on an ongoing basis and that kind of thing. You probably have all heard of reverse vesting, I'm guessing. This is for the purpose of you don't want to have a taxable event when the founders get their equity. So you want to issue it in the very beginning of the entity's life when there is presumably no value in the entity. So maybe you sell stock to the founders for 1/1000th of a penny per share. But you don't, and let's say you have 4 founders, they're all supposed to be working at the business. You put reverse vesting in place so that if one of them quits in 2 months, the company can get his stock back for what he paid for it, which is a dime or whatever. You don't want someone to be able to quit and take off within the next probably 3 or 4 years and maintain 100% of his equity. So that's what reverse vesting is for. And the reason we do it as reverse vesting rather than forward vesting is for tax purposes. So if you get equity that is subject to reverse vesting and you don't file what's called an 83B election, then supposedly you're going to have taxable income every time your restrictions lapse over time. So for that reason, you file an 83B election in the beginning and you say to the IRS, I want to take any income that's with respect to this stock I'm getting into account now rather than later. And then you tell the IRS the fair market value of the stock is a dime and I paid a dime, so therefore I have no income. And then you have your shares, you get to vote your shares. They're just subject to being bought back or forfeited if you leave within some certain time frame. And of course, that vesting can be set out however the founders think is a reasonable vesting schedule. And restrictions on transfer, obviously, you don't want someone to be able to just sell his stock to an outsider that you may not want to be partners with. So it's always a good idea to have restrictions on transfer of shares. So I've already talked a bit about equity versus options or profit interests. I mean, when someone owns equity, they may have a vote. If it's a corporation, they do have a vote, although you can authorize non-voting stock, but it's not that frequent. Options and profit interests are what you would give. Let's say you formed a company, you were looking for a 4th partner, but you didn't find them for a whole year. And during that year, the company's value had built up to $1 million or $2 million or $3 million. Now, if you give him his equity, you give him stock, maybe even with reverse vesting, he's going to have a whole bunch of income in respect of that issuance. So at that point, you're probably going to give that person options if it's a corporation, or profit interest if it's an LLC, so that he doesn't have a big taxable event on his receipt of his interest. So when you grant an option, if it has the correct strike price, which has to be at least fair market value of the underlying shares, the grantee should not have a tax event. And when you grant profit interest, if they're granted properly, the grantee does not have a tax event. So that, that's why in the early life of an entity, we use a lot of reverse vesting, or for the founders at least, we use reverse vesting equity. But later on, when there's more value in the company, we use options or profit interest to avoid a tax issue to the recipient of those interests. Any questions? Okay, I'm assuming everyone's still here, and I'm going to keep going. So these are just some items that I thought we might want to talk about. I mentioned the profit interest complexity. They're hard for the grantee to understand. They're hard for the management of the company to understand. And in addition, the IRS says that if you're a member of an LLC, which a profit interest holder is, you cannot be paid for services by that LLC on a W-2. It has to be treated as a distribution on your interest in the company, reported on a K-1. Now, in practice, a ton of companies that are LLCs are paying employees that may own a small interest on a W-2, and the IRS has not been known to complain that I know of, because they get their withholding. It doesn't really harm them. So one of the issues with respect to profit interest or option grants is that you have to figure out the value of the company in order to avoid a tax event for the recipient. With option grants under the Internal Revenue Code, there's a safe harbor. You have to price the grant at least fair market value of the underlying shares. And there's a safe harbor for making that determination, which requires an outside third-party appraisal. So we have a lot of startup companies that do get these appraisals so that their option grants are clean and at the right price, and they have records to back up the price. And a startup can get one of these valuations for as little as $2,500. Those valuations last only for 12 months, or if some big event happens in between, like a financing or something gets commercialized, then the valuation has to be redone. But even if you're giving a profit interest, you also have to make some kind of determination of what the value of the company is, so that the grantee doesn't get a taxable event. A profit interest gives them the appreciation of their interest only from the point of grant until the exit event, or whenever they get rid of the profit interest if it's cashed out. Option grants have to be approved by a board of directors every time. They cannot be approved. They can't be backdated. You can't approve them after the fact. This is a big issue in diligence on an acquisition. It's in publicly traded companies. It has resulted in people going to jail that they were backdating options so that the grantee could get a really small strike price when the value was much higher. So when you do have an option plan and you're going to authorize option grants, you have to be careful to have a formal board vote, and the price has to be determined, the vesting schedule, and all that sort of stuff. And lack of records on options can blow up deals. If you're doing reverse vesting, it's important to have a proper agreement in place. And I'm not saying this just to promote legal services. I've just seen a lot of companies come in that have tried to do their own documents, and it's really a mess. I'm in the midst of some diligence for possible merger right now, and the other side has terrible records. We can't figure out who owns what. None of their contracts are signed. There's no board approvals for the option grants, and this problem may end up blowing the whole deal up. 83B elections, if you do issue reverse vesting equity, even in an LLC, we file these, although it's not absolutely required yet, but people do file them as a precaution. These have to be filed with the IRS within 30 days after the grant, which is a short timeline. It has been extended this summer because of the pandemic, but generally those are due within 30 days, so you have to pay attention to that. Stock option plans are very common and pretty standard. They're not a big deal to put into place. There are different types of stock options that have different tax treatment. If you are giving options to employees that are actual employees under the federal definition, they can get incentive stock options, which have the potential for capital gain treatment on the spread between the strike price and the eventual sale price on an exit. That's an ISO, so it has the potential for cap gains treatment. It can only be issued to an employee under the Internal Revenue Code, and you don't have a taxable event on exercise. A non-qualified stock option is what you give to consultants and advisors, independent contractors. They do have a taxable event upon exercise to the extent of the difference between the strike price and the then fair market value. Dilution, oops, I went too quick to that slide, although I may just jump to that slide anyway. Well, no, we'll talk about this for a minute. So I talked about the tax treatment, I think, of all those types of issuances. There are alternatives to equity-related incentives. You know, you can do bonus agreements, exit participation agreements, stock appreciation rights, unit appreciation rights, phantom stock rights. They are a bit complicated, but they end up with, you know, a very similar incentive, but the person doesn't actually own equity. There was a really contractual arrangements, but you do have to worry about Section 409A of the Internal Revenue Code and deferred compensation issues. So now I just wanted to give you an example about. And let me know if I should stop. Mark, interrupt me if.
We do have two questions.
Okay.
So first being, what's the tax impact if some of the founders' shares vest at incorporation?
Well, if there's no value in the company and you're just getting the shares for whatever you're getting the shares for, $1,000, if you're putting in $10,000 and you've just formed the company and you're getting your stock, there's no tax implication there. If they're fully vested and you're paying for them, or even if you're only putting in 10 cents, there's no tax implication on getting founder shares at inception.
Okay. And what is the impact of issuing stock certificate in a startup? Should founders prefer to share a PDF copy, or does it not matter?
Well, so we, you know, historically, we have always issued paper stock certificates for corporations, which gets to be a real pain, especially now. LLCs generally do not certificate their interests. It's usually, sometimes they do, but not very often. Usually it's just in the register of owners, in the paper records. There aren't certificates issued to the owners. Lately, I have been starting to do stock certificates as PDFs and even send them out by DocuSign for signatures. And so then we just have an electronic copy. But also, we're now trending toward using uncertificated stock in corporations, just like in an LLC. because when you have paper stock certificates, first you have to get them prepared, and they're not usually something that can just be done on the machine, on the computer in a Word document. They're on a paper form that's got green edges or whatever. So that gets cumbersome. Then you have to mail it out to the client to have two people or maybe one person sign it as president and treasurer or whatever. Then they have to send it back. Then you have to send it out to the stockholders with a receipt. And it's just a big waste of time. So it all depends what the parties agree on. You can definitely do them electronically, or you can have the board say our stock is going to be uncertificated, and then you just keep a stock ledger and you never issue certificates at all.
What are the benefits of being certificated versus not? Is it really just up to the board's preference?
Yeah, I mean, the benefit to being uncertificated is really just to save the money of having the lawyers have to get the stock certificates out and back and then out and all that. I mean, some people may prefer to have something in their possession, but LLCs have been operating for quite a while now, and almost always the interests are uncertificated. It makes it much easier to do transfers. You don't have to have someone dig up the certificate in their, safe deposit box or whatever and send it back to the lawyers. It's just a question of saving money, really.
And then last question for that last slide. During M&A, does the founder have to go secure all the issued certifications back, or can issued certifications be voided somehow?
I'm sorry. So you're saying, like, if you do a merger where the stock is going to be exchanged for cash of some acquirer?
Yes. So during a merger acquisition, does the founder need to go secure the issued certificates back, or can you somehow void those certificates, or do you just have them on file somewhere?
Yes, usually if paper certificates have been issued, then when an acquisition happens, the shareholders or the equity holders have to return those in order to get their proceeds. However, people lose these things all the time. And usually if it's a privately held company, you can just give an affidavit of loss and say, I lost the stock certificate, I don't have it, I never transferred the shares to anyone, I'll indemnify the company if they suffer any damages due to this loss. So that happens frequently, that we have to use affidavits of loss because people can't find their certificates. But if they do have them, and if they have paper certificates, the acquirer will be asking for those back, and anyone who can't send it back will have to sign an affidavit of loss.
All right, so now moving on to the next one.
Okay, so I just thought I would give a dilution example, because I hear people a lot of times saying, well, if I bring in an investor, that's going to dilute me. I don't want to be diluted. But the fact is, if you bring in an investor, yes, you may own a smaller piece of the pie, but your piece of the pie is now worth more, or worth the same as your piece of the pie was before. So this is an example. So Joe owns 100% of company X, which is worth $15,000. Of course, the value of a company is always up for question, right? So you have to assume that's a valid valuation. He wants to raise $3,000. He's willing to sell equity. Oh, look, I changed it to Jane up here, and I forgot to. So Jane has had a sex change operation during this transaction and is now Mike. Sorry about that. He's going to sell equity to Jane to raise the money. So the pre-money valuation is $15,000. The pre-money shares outstanding, that's what Joe owns, 500. So the price per share is going to be the pre-money valuation divided by the number of shares outstanding, which is 30. So since he's going to raise $3,000, he's going to sell $3,000 divided by the price per share, which is 100 shares. So the post-money shares outstanding is what he owned, the 500, plus the 100 that he issued to Jane, which is now 600. The post-money valuation is the 15,000 plus the 3,000 that Jane put in, so it's now 18,000. So Joe still has 500 shares. They're still worth $15,000 because he owns 500 out of 600 shares, and the company is now worth 18,000. and this should say Jane here. But, people complain about dilution, but you have to realize that the dilution is happening because you're bringing value into the company. If it's an investment, obviously. Sometimes you get diluted for other reasons, which are not adding value. I think that maybe, yeah, so let me know if you have a question, Mark. So just to talk a little bit about what an investor is going to look for, say an angel or a VC, if you really get something good and you get to meetings with potential investors, what are they going to want? Well, they're going to want your company to have good records. That's one thing. They may impose founder vesting on your equity in order to do the investment, even if you didn't have vesting before. Because they may say, well, I'll put in $2 million, but you and Joe have to stay here for at least 2 or 3 more years. They also will want to make sure that you have proper assignments of inventions, especially if you have outside independent contractors creating any sort of IP. That's a problem if you don't have a contract where those contractors assign over their work product to the company. That can hold up a deal badly too. I mean, with employees, it's still advisable to have them sign something, even though by law, the employer owns their work product. And some things that an investor who invests a lot will look for, they will probably want preferred equity, which would either be preferred stock or a preferred class of units in an LLC. They may want participating preferred equity, which means it gets a liquidation preference above everyone else, and then it participates in the next tier along with the non-preferred equity holders. They may want a guaranteed preferred return, which is like interest 5 or 6 or 8%. They will probably want rights of first refusal on founders transferring their equity. So the investors will want the right to buy that, or usually the right goes to the company first. So the company has a first right to buy it at whatever terms the stockholders proposing to sell it to a third party. Then if the company says no, the investors will want the secondary right of refusal to buy those shares. Then they'll probably want rights of co-sale also, which means if they say, well, no, I don't want to buy the shares, but I want to join, I'm going to tag along with you on the sale to your third party. Then they'll be able to sell a proportionate piece of their stock, and the amount that the founder can sell will be reduced. And they also usually will want preemptive rights, which is the right to participate in new issuances of securities by the company, with certain exceptions. Option plans are excluded and various things like that get excluded from those preemptive rights. But those are generally the terms that an outside investor will want.
So, Julie, you mentioned signing over IP, making sure that they have all of that protected. Let's say you're an early stage startup. You're not able to pay your employees yet, so essentially everyone's just working on the project. And so, would you recommend, at that stage, should they really go consult with a lawyer right away to get an IP agreement written up? Or can they find one online? Or is that something that you could backdate when you are generating revenue and aren't able to hire a lawyer?
Well, you don't want to backdate it. You want it to be signed when they start creating something for you, but you also want there to be some consideration for the agreement. If you're not paying them anything, that could be tough. I think you could probably find decent forums online. It's just hard for me to tell anyone to just do it on their own because I've seen so many errors in that. The best thing would be if you have a friend who's a lawyer who will give you a free document. I would use that.
Yeah, that's always nice. So another question here. If a company raises Series A at $5 a share, is it correct to say that even common stock is worth $5 a share, or will common need to be represented at the 409A price?
Well, so that depends for what purpose. I mean, when you talk about fully, post-money valuation, you would multiply the fully diluted number of shares, including common, by the price per share that you charged for the preferred stock in the raise that you just did. But nobody really thinks the common stock is worth that amount, especially if you're issuing stock options. I mean, the common stock is worth what the 409A value says. So it's really for different purposes that you use the two different values. Common stock is worth less than preferred stock because it comes later in the waterfall. But if you're talking about post-money valuation right after a round, you are going to use the preferred stock price and just multiply it by the fully diluted number of shares.
Okay.
I think that's my last one.
All right. So do you guys have any more questions? And yes, this webinar is recorded for later usage. So I'll send that out afterwards for all of you guys. So do you guys have any other questions for Julie? Let's see. So they're asking if they would be able to connect with you. So like, what's your email address so that they could send you additional questions or might be able to get some advice in the future?
Okay, so it's J O'Neill, which is JONEILL @bowditch.com.
And I'll include that when I send out the recording later as well, so everyone has that. All right, if we don't have any other questions, then thank you so very much for joining us, and I hope this was useful.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.